Chapter 6. I arrived home, feeling exhausted. Force of habit made me flick on the light in the hallway, even though the bulb had gone. We'd been meaning to replace it but kept forgetting. I knew at once that Kathy wasn't there. It was too quiet. She was incapable of quiet. She wasn't noisy, but her world was full of sound. Talking on the phone, reciting lines, watching movies, singing, humming, listening to bands I'd never heard of. But now the flat was silent as a tomb. I called her name. Force of habit, again, or a guilty conscience perhaps, wanting to make sure I was alone before I transgressed. Kathy? No reply. I fumbled my way through the dark into the living room. I turned on the light. The room leaped out at me in the way new furniture always does until you're used to it. New chairs, new cushions, new colors, reds and yellows, where there once had been black and white. A vase of pink lilies, Kathy's favorite flowers, was on the table. Their strong, musky scent made the air thick and hard to breathe. What time was it? 8:30. Where was she? Rehearsal? She was in a new production of Othello at the RSC, and it wasn't going particularly well. Endless rehearsals had been taking their toll. She seemed visibly tired, pale, thinner than usual, fighting a cold. "I'm so fucking sick all the time," she said. "I'm exhausted." It was true. She'd come back from rehearsal later and later each night, looking terrible. She'd yawn and stumble straight into bed, so she probably wouldn't be home for a couple of hours at the earliest. I decided to risk it. I took the jar of weed from its hiding place and started rolling a joint. I'd been smoking marijuana since university. I first encountered it during my first term, alone and friendless at a fresher party, too paralyzed with fear to initiate a conversation with any of the good-looking and confident young people around me. I was planning my escape when the girl standing next to me offered me something. I thought it was a cigarette until I smelled the spicy, pungent, curling black smoke. Too shy to refuse, I accepted it and brought the joint to my lips. It was badly rolled and coming unstuck, unraveling at the end. The tip was wet and stained red from her lipstick. It tasted different from a cigarette. It was richer, rawer, more exotic. I swallowed down the thick smoke and tried not to cough. Initially, all I felt was a little light on my feet. Like sex, clearly more fuss was made over marijuana than it merited. Then, a minute or so later, something happened. Something incredible. It was like being drenched in an enormous wave of well-being. I felt safe, relaxed, totally at ease, silly, and unself-conscious. That was it. Before long, I was smoking weed every day. It became my best friend, my inspiration, my solace, an endless ritual of rolling, licking, lighting. I would get stoned just from the rustling of rolling papers and the anticipation of the warm, intoxicating high. All kinds of theories have been put forward about the origins of addiction. It could be genetic, it could be chemical, it could be psychological. But marijuana was doing something much more than soothing me. Crucially, it altered the way I experienced my emotions. It cradled me and held me safe like a well-loved child. In other words, it contained me. The psychoanalyst W.R. Bion came up with the term containment to describe a mother's ability to manage her baby's pain. Remember, babyhood is not a time of bliss, it's one of terror. As babies, we are trapped in a strange, alien world, unable to see properly, constantly surprised at our bodies, alarmed by hunger and wind and bowel movements, overwhelmed by our feelings. We are quite literally under attack. We need our mother to soothe our distress and make sense of our experience. As she does so, we slowly learn how to manage our physical and emotional states on our own. But our ability to contain ourselves directly depends on our mother's ability to contain us. If she had never experienced containment by her own mother, how could she teach us what she did not know? Someone who has never learned to contain himself is plagued by anxious feelings for the rest of his life, feelings that Bion aptly titled nameless dread. Such a person endlessly seeks this unquenchable containment from external sources. He needs a drink or a joint to take the edge off this endless anxiety, hence my addiction to marijuana. I talked a lot about marijuana in therapy. I wrestled with the idea of giving it up and wondered why the prospect scared me so much. Ruth said that enforcement and constraint never produced anything good, and that rather than force myself to live without weed, a better starting place might be to acknowledge that I was now dependent on it and unwilling or unable to abandon it. Whatever marijuana did for me was still working, Ruth argued, until the day it would outlive its usefulness when I would probably relinquish it with ease. Ruth was right. When I met Kathy and fell in love, marijuana faded into the background. I was naturally high on love, with no need to artificially induce a good mood. It helped that Kathy didn't smoke it. Stoners, in her opinion, were weak-willed and lazy and lived in slow motion. You pricked them, and 6 days later they'd say, "Ouch." I stopped smoking weed the day Kathy moved into my flat. And, as Ruth had predicted, once I was secure and happy, the habit fell away from me quite naturally, like dry, caked mud from a boot. I might never have smoked it again if we hadn't gone to a leaving party for Kathy's friend Nicole, who was moving to New York. Kathy was monopolized by all her actor friends, and I found myself alone. A short, stubby man wearing a pair of neon pink glasses nudged me and said, "Want some?" I was about to refuse the joint between his fingers when something stopped me. I'm not sure what. A momentary whim? Or an unconscious attack on Kathy for forcing me to come to this horrible party and then abandoning me? I looked around, and she was nowhere to be seen. Fuck it, I thought. I brought the joint to my lips and inhaled. Just like that, I was back where I had started, as if there had been no break. My addiction had been patiently waiting for me all this time, like a faithful dog. I didn't tell Kathy what I had done, and I put it out of my mind. In fact, I was waiting for an opportunity, and 6 weeks later, it presented itself. Kathy went to New York for a week to visit Nicole. Without Kathy's influence, lonely and bored, I gave in to temptation. I didn't have a dealer anymore, so I did what I had done as a student, and made my way to Camden Town Market. As I left the station, I could smell marijuana in the air, mingled with the scent of incense and food stalls frying onions. I walked over to the bridge by Camden Lock. I stood there awkwardly, pushed and nudged by an endless stream of tourists and teenagers trudging back and forth across the bridge. I scanned the crowd. There was no sign of any of the dealers who used to line the bridge, calling out to you as you passed. I spotted a couple of police officers, unmissable in their bright yellow jackets, patrolling the crowd. They walked away from the bridge toward the station. Then I heard a low voice by my side. "Want some green, mate?" I looked down, and there was a small man. I thought he was a child at first. He was so slight and slender. But his face was a road map of rugged terrain, lined and crossed, like a boy prematurely aged. He was missing his 2 front teeth, giving his words a slight whistle. "Green?" he repeated. I nodded. He jerked his head at me to follow him. He slipped through the crowd and went around the corner and along a back street. He entered an old pub, and I followed. It was deserted inside, dingy and tattered, and stank of vomit and old cigarette smoke. "Guess a beer," he said, hovering at the bar. He was scarcely tall enough to see over it. I begrudgingly bought him half a pint. He took it to a table in the corner. I sat opposite him. He looked around furtively, then reached under the table and slipped me a small package wrapped in cellophane. I gave him some cash. I went home and I opened the package, half expecting to have been ripped off, but a familiar pungent smell drifted to my nose. I saw the little green buds streaked with gold. My heart raced as though I had encountered a long-lost friend, which I suppose I had. From then on, I would get high occasionally, whenever I found myself alone in the flat for a few hours, when I was sure Kathy would not be coming back anytime soon. That night, when I came home, tired and frustrated, and found Kathy out at rehearsal, I quickly rolled a joint. I smoked it out of the bathroom window, but I smoked too much, too fast. It hit me hard, like a punch between the eyes. I was so stoned, even walking felt difficult, like wading through treacle. I went through my usual sanitizing ritual, air freshener, brushing my teeth, taking a shower, and I carefully maneuvered myself to the living room. I sank onto the sofa. I looked for the TV remote but couldn't see it. Then I located it, peeking out from behind Kathy's open laptop on the coffee table. I reached for it but was so stoned I knocked over the laptop. I propped the laptop up again, and the screen came to life. It was logged into her email account. For some reason, I kept staring at it. I was transfixed. Her inbox stared at me like a gaping hole. I couldn't look away. All kinds of things jumped out before I knew what I was reading. Words such as sexy and fuck in the email headings, and repeated emails from BADBOY22. If only I'd stopped there. If only I'd got up and walked away. But I didn't. I clicked on the most recent email and opened it. The subject, Re, Little Miss Fuck, from Katerama Waitan 1 to Bad Boy 22. I'm on the bus, so horny for you. I can smell you on me, I feel like a slut. Henek X6C sent from my iPhone. Sikchi Wudadanaste. Gang subject, Re, Little Miss Fuck from Bad Boy 22. To Katerama 1, you are a slut. Lowell, see you later, after rehearsal. Subject, Re, Little Miss Fuck from Bad Boy 2. To Katerama 1. Okay, we'll see what time I can get away. I'll text. You too. E. Subject, Re, Little Miss Fuck from Katerama 1 to Bad Boy 2. Okay, 830, 9, EKX, sent from my iPhone. I pulled the laptop from the table. I sat with it on my lap, staring at it. I don't know how long I sat like that. 10 minutes? 20 minutes? Half an hour? Maybe longer. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I tried to process what I had just seen, but I was still so stoned, I wasn't sure what I had seen. Was it real? Or some kind of misunderstanding? Some joke I wasn't getting because I was so high? I forced myself to read another email, and another. I ended up going through all of Kathy's emails to BADBOY22. Some were sexual, obscene even. Others were longer, more confessional, emotional, and she sounded drunk. Perhaps they were written late at night after I had gone to bed. I pictured myself in the bedroom, asleep, while Kathy was out here writing intimate messages to this stranger. This stranger she was fucking. Time caught up with itself with a jolt. Suddenly, I was no longer stoned. I was horribly, painfully sober. There was a wrenching pain in my stomach. I threw aside the laptop. I ran into the bathroom. I fell to my knees in front of the toilet and threw up. Chapter 7. This feels rather different from last time, I said. No response. Alicia sat opposite me in the chair, head turned slightly toward the window. She sat perfectly still, her spine rigid and straight. She looked like a cellist or a soldier. I'm thinking of how the last session ended, when you physically attacked me and had to be restrained. No response. I hesitated. I wonder if you did it as some kind of test? To see what I'm made of? I think it's important that you know I'm not easily intimidated. I can take whatever you throw at me. Alicia looked out the window at the gray sky beyond the bars. I waited a moment. There's something I need to tell you, Alicia. That I'm on your side. Hopefully one day you'll believe that. Of course, it takes time to build trust. My old therapist used to say intimacy requires the repeated experience of being responded to, and that doesn't happen overnight. Alicia stared at me, unblinking, with an inscrutable gaze. The minutes passed. It felt more like an endurance test than a therapy session. I wasn't making progress in any direction, it seemed. Perhaps it was all hopeless. Christian had been right to point out that rats desert sinking ships. What the hell was I doing clambering upon this wreck, lashing myself to the mast, preparing to drown? The answer was sitting in front of me. As Diomedes put it, Alicia was a silent siren, luring me to my doom. I felt a sudden desperation. I wanted to scream at her, say something, anything, just talk. But I didn't say that. Instead, I broke with therapeutic tradition. I stopped treading softly and got directly to the point. I'd like to talk about your silence, about what it means, what it feels like, and specifically why you stopped talking. Alicia didn't look at me. Was she even listening? As I sit here with you, a picture keeps coming into my mind. an image of someone biting their fist, holding back a yell, swallowing a scream. I remember when I first started therapy, I found it very hard to cry. I feared I'd be carried away by the flood, overwhelmed. Perhaps that's what it feels like for you. That's why it's important to take your time to feel safe and trust that you won't be alone in this flood, that I'm treading water here with you. Silence. I think of myself as a relational therapist. Do you know what that means? Silence. It means I think Freud was wrong about a couple of things. I don't believe a therapist can ever really be a blank slate, as he intended. We leak all kinds of information about ourselves unintentionally, by the color of my socks, or how I sit, or the way I talk. Just by sitting here with you, I reveal a great deal about myself. Despite my best efforts at invisibility, I'm showing you who I am. Alicia looked up. She stared at me, her chin slightly tilted. Was there a challenge in that look? At last, I had her attention. I shifted in my seat. The point is, what can we do about this? We can ignore it and deny it and pretend this therapy is all about you. Or we can acknowledge that this is a two-way street and work with that. And then we can really start to get somewhere. I held up my hand. I nodded at my wedding ring. This ring tells you something, doesn't it? Alicia's eyes ever so slowly moved in the direction of the ring. It tells you I'm a married man. It tells you I have a wife. We've been married for nearly 9 years. No response, yet she kept staring at the ring. You were married for about 7 years, weren't you? No reply. I love my wife very much. Did you love your husband? Alicia's eyes moved. They darted up to my face. We stared at each other. Love includes all kinds of feelings, doesn't it? Good and bad. I love my wife. Her name is Kathy. But sometimes I get angry with her. Sometimes I hate her. Alicia kept staring at me. I felt like a rabbit in the headlights, frozen, unable to look away or move. The attack alarm was on the table, within reach. I made a concerted effort not to look at it. I knew I shouldn't keep talking, that I should shut up, but I couldn't stop myself. I went on compulsively. And when I say I hate her, I don't mean all of me hates her. Just a part of me hates. It's about holding on to both parts at the same time. Part of you loved Gabriel. Part of you hated him. Alicia shook her head. No. A brief movement, but definite. Finally, a response. I felt a sudden thrill. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. Part of you hated him, I said again more firmly. Another shake of the head. Her eyes burned through me. She's getting angry, I thought. It's true, Alicia. Or you wouldn't have killed him. Alicia suddenly jumped up. I thought she was about to leap on me. My body tensed in anticipation. But instead she turned and marched to the door. She hammered on it with her fists. There was the sound of a key turning, and Yuri threw open the door. He looked relieved not to find Alicia strangling me on the floor. She pushed past him and ran into the corridor. Steady on. Slow down, honey. He glanced back at me. Everything okay? What happened? I didn't reply. Yuri gave me a funny look and left. I was alone. Idiot, I thought to myself. You idiot. What was I doing? I'd pushed her too far, too hard, too soon. It was horribly unprofessional, not to mention totally fucking inept. It revealed far more about my state of mind than hers. But that's what Alicia did for you. Her silence was like a mirror, reflecting yourself back at you. And it was often an ugly sight. Chapter 8. You don't need to be a psychotherapist to suspect that Kathy had left her laptop open because, unconsciously at least, she wanted me to find out about her infidelity. Well, now I had found out. Now I knew. I hadn't spoken to her since the other night, feigning sleep when she got back and leaving the flat in the morning before she woke up. I was avoiding her, avoiding myself. I was in shock. I knew I had to take a look at myself, or risk losing myself. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath as I rolled a joint. I smoked it out of the window and then, suitably stoned, I poured a glass of wine in the kitchen. The glass slipped out of my grasp as I picked it up. I tried to catch it as it fell, but only succeeded in thrusting my hand into a shard of glass as it smashed on the table, slicing a chunk of flesh from my finger. Suddenly, blood was everywhere. Blood trickling down my arm, blood on broken glass, blood mingling with white wine on the table. I struggled to tear off some kitchen paper and bound my finger tight to stem the flow. I held my hand above my head, watching blood stream down my arm in tiny diverging rivulets, mimicking the pattern of veins beneath my skin. I thought of Kathy. It was Kathy I would reach for in a moment of crisis, when I needed sympathy or reassurance or someone to kiss it better. I wanted her to look after me. I thought about calling her, but even as I had this thought, I imagined a door closing fast, slamming shut, locking her out of reach. Kathy was gone. I had lost her. I wanted to cry, but couldn't. I was blocked up inside, packed with mud and shit. Fuck, I kept repeating to myself. Fuck. I became conscious of the clock ticking. It seemed louder now somehow. I tried to focus on it and anchor my spinning thoughts. Tick, tick, tick. But the chorus of voices in my head grew louder and wouldn't be silenced. She was bound to be unfaithful, I thought. This had to happen. It was inevitable. I was never good enough for her. I was useless, ugly, worthless, nothing. She was bound to tire of me eventually. I didn't deserve her. I didn't deserve anything. It went on and on, one horrible thought after another punching me. How little I knew her. Those emails demonstrated I'd been living with a stranger. Now I saw the truth. Kathy hadn't saved me. She wasn't capable of saving anyone. She was no heroine to be admired. Just a frightened, fucked-up girl. A cheating liar. This whole mythology of us that I had built up. Our hopes and dreams, likes and dislikes. Our plans for the future. A life that had seemed so secure, so sturdy, now collapsed in seconds, like a house of cards in a gust of wind. My mind went to that cold room at college all those years ago, tearing open packets of paracetamol with clumsy, numb fingers. The same numbness overtook me now, that same desire to curl up and die. I thought of my mother. Could I call her? Turn to her in my moment of desperation and need? I imagined her answering the phone, her voice shaky. Just how shaky depended on my father's mood and if she'd been drinking. She might listen sympathetically to me, but her mind would be elsewhere. One eye on my dad and his temper. How could she help me? How can one drowning rat save another? I had to get out. I couldn't breathe in here in this flat with these stinking lilies. I needed some air. I needed to breathe. I left the flat. I dug my hands in my pockets and kept my head low. I pounded the streets, walking fast, going nowhere. In my mind, I kept going back over our relationship, scene by scene, remembering it, examining it, turning it over, looking for clues. I remembered unresolved fights, unexplained absences, and frequent lateness. But I also remembered small acts of kindness, affectionate notes she'd leave for me in unexpected places, moments of sweetness and apparently genuine love. How was this possible? Had she been acting the whole time? Had she ever loved me? I remembered the flicker of doubt I'd had upon meeting her friends. They were all actors, loud, narcissistic, preening, endlessly talking about themselves and people I didn't know. Suddenly, I was transported back to school, hovering alone on the fringes of the playground watching the other kids play. I convinced myself Kathy wasn't like them at all, but clearly she was. If had I encountered them that first night at the bar when I met her, would they have put me off her? I doubt it. Nothing could have prevented our union. From the moment I saw Kathy, my fate was written. What should I do? Confront her, of course. Tell her everything I had seen. She'd react by denying it. Then, seeing it was hopeless, she would admit the truth and prostrate herself, stricken with remorse. She'd beg my forgiveness, wouldn't she? What if she didn't? What if she scorned me? What if she laughed, turned on her heel, and left? What then? Between the two of us, I had the most to lose. That was obvious. Kathy would survive. She was fond of saying she was tough as nails. She'd pick herself up, dust herself off, and forget all about me. But I wouldn't forget about her. How could I? Without Kathy, I'd return to that empty, solitary existence I had endured before. I'd never meet anyone like her again, never have that same connection or experience that depth of feeling for another human being. She was the love of my life. She was my life, and I wasn't ready to give her up. Not yet. Even though she had betrayed me, I still loved her. Perhaps I was crazy after all. A solitary bird shrieked above my head, startling me. I stopped and looked around. I'd gone much farther than I thought. Shocked, I saw where my feet had carried me. I had walked to within a couple of streets of Ruth's front door. Without intending to, I had unconsciously made my way to my old therapist in a time of trouble, as I had done so many times in the past. It was a testament to how upset I was that I considered going up to her door and ringing the bell and asking for help. And why not? I thought suddenly. Yes, it was unprofessional and highly improper conduct, but I was desperate and I needed help. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of Ruth's green door, watching my hand reach up to the buzzer and press it. It took her a few moments to answer it. A light went on the hallway. Then she opened the door, keeping the chain on. Ruth peered out through the crack. She looked older. She must be in her 80s now, smaller, frailer than I remembered, and slightly stooped. She was wearing a gray cardigan over a pale pink nightgown. "Hello," she said nervously. "Who's there?" "Hello, Ruth?" I stepped into the light. She recognized me and looked surprised. "Theo, what on earth?" Her eyes went from my face to the clumsy, improvised bandage around my. Chapter 9. Ruth showed me into the living room. "Would you like a cup of tea?" The room was as it had always been, as I'd always remembered it. The rug, the heavy drapes, the silver clock ticking on the mantel, the armchair, the faded blue couch. I felt instantly reassured. To be honest, I could do with something stronger. Ruth shot me a brief, piercing glance but didn't comment, nor did she refuse, as I half expected. She poured me a glass of sherry and handed it to me. I sat on the couch. Force of habit made me sit where I had always done for therapy, on the far left side, resting my arm on the armrest. The fabric underneath my fingertips had been worn thin by the anxious rubbing of many patients, myself included. I took a sip of sherry. It was warm, sweet, and a little sickly, but I drank it down, conscious of Ruth watching me the whole time. Her gaze was obvious but not heavy or uncomfortable. In 20 years, Ruth had never managed to make me feel uncomfortable. I didn't speak again until I had finished the sherry and the glass was empty. It feels odd to be sitting here with a glass in my hand. I know you're not in the habit of offering drinks to your patients. You're not my patient anymore. Just a friend, and by the look of you, she added gently, you need a friend right now. Do I look that bad? You do, I'm afraid, and it must be serious, or you wouldn't come over uninvited like this. Certainly not at 10 o'clock at night. You're right, I felt I had no choice. What is it, Theo? What's the matter? I don't know how to tell you. I don't know where to start. How about the beginning? I nodded. I took a breath and began. I told her about everything that had happened. I told her about starting marijuana again, and how I had been smoking it secretly, and how it had led to my discovering Kathy's emails and her affair. I spoke quickly, breathlessly, wanting to get it off my chest. I felt as if I were at confession. Ruth listened without interruption until I had finished. It was hard to read her expression. Finally, she said, I am very sorry this happened, Theo. I know how much Kathy means to you, how much you love her. Yes, I stopped, unable to say her name. There was a tremor in my voice. Ruth picked up on it and edged the box of tissues toward me. I used to get angry when she would do that in our sessions. I'd accuse her of trying to make me cry. She would generally succeed, but not tonight. Tonight, my tears were frozen, a reservoir of ice. I had been seeing Ruth for a long time before I met Kathy, and I continued therapy for the first 3 years of our relationship. I remember the advice Ruth gave me when Kathy and I first got together. Choosing a lover is a lot like choosing a therapist. We need to ask ourselves, is this someone who will be honest with me, listen to criticism, admit making mistakes, and not promise the impossible? I told all this to Kathy at the time, and she suggested we make a pact. We swore never to lie to each other, never pretend, always be truthful. "What happened?" I said. "What went wrong?" Ruth hesitated before she spoke. What she said surprised me. "I suspect you know the answer to that. If you would just admit it to yourself." "I don't know." I shook my head. "I don't." I fell into indignant silence. Yet I had a sudden image of Kathy writing all those emails and how passionate they were, how charged, as if she was getting high from writing them, from the clandestine nature of her relationship with this man. She enjoyed lying and sneaking around. It was like acting, but off stage. "I think she's bored," I said eventually. "What makes you say that?" "Because she needs excitement, drama. She always has. She's been complaining, for a while I suppose, that we don't have any fun anymore, that I'm always stressed, that I work too hard. We fought about it recently. She kept using the word fireworks. Fireworks? As in there aren't any. Between us." "Ah, I see." Ruth nodded. "We've talked about this before, haven't we? About fireworks? About love. About how we often mistake love for fireworks, for drama and dysfunction. But real love is very quiet, very still. It's boring, if seen from the perspective of high drama. Love is deep and calm, and constant. I imagine you do give Kathy love, in the true sense of the word. Whether or not she is capable of giving it back to you is another question." I stared at the box of tissues on the table in front of me. I didn't like where Ruth was going. I tried to deflect her. There are faults on both sides. I lied to her too, about the weed. Ruth smiled sadly. "I don't know if persistent sexual and emotional betrayal with another human being is on the same level as getting stoned every now and then. I think it points to a very different kind of individual. Someone who is able to lie repeatedly and lie well, who can betray their partner without feeling any remorse." "You don't know that." I sounded as pathetic as I felt. She might feel terrible. But even as I said that, I didn't believe it. Neither did Ruth. "I don't think so. I think her behavior suggests she is quite damaged, lacking in empathy and integrity and just plain kindness. All the qualities you brim with." I shook my head. "That's not true." "It is true, Theo." Ruth hesitated. "Don't you think perhaps you've been here before? With Kathy?" Ruth shook her head. "I don't mean that. I mean with your parents, when you were younger. If there's a childhood dynamic here you might be replaying." "No." I suddenly felt irritated. "What's happening with Kathy has got nothing to do with my childhood." "Oh, really?" Ruth sounded disbelieving. "Trying to please someone unpredictable, someone emotionally unavailable, uncaring, unkind, trying to keep them happy, win their love. Is this not an old story, Theo? A familiar story?" I clenched my fist and didn't speak. Ruth went on hesitantly. "I know how sad you feel, but I want you to consider the possibility that you felt this sadness long before you met Kathy. It's a sadness you've been carrying around for many years. You know, Theo, one of the hardest things to admit is that we weren't loved when we needed it most. It's a terrible feeling, the pain of not being loved." She was right. I had been groping for the right words to express that murky feeling of betrayal inside, the horrible hollow ache, and to hear Ruth say it, the pain of not being loved, I saw how it pervaded my entire consciousness and was at once the story of my past, present, and future. This wasn't just about Kathy. It was about my father and my childhood feelings of abandonment, my grief for everything I never had and, in my heart, still believed I never would have. Ruth was saying that was why I chose Kathy. What better way for me to prove that my father was correct, that I'm worthless and unlovable, than by pursuing someone who will never love me? I buried my head in my hands. So, all this was inevitable. That's what you're saying. I set myself up for this? It's fucking hopeless? It's not hopeless. You're not a boy at the mercy of your father anymore. You're a grown man now, and you have a choice. Use this as another confirmation of how unworthy you are, or break with the past. Free yourself from endlessly repeating it. How do I do that? You think I should leave her? I think it's a very difficult situation. But you think I should leave, don't you? You've come too far and worked too hard to return to a life of dishonesty and denial and emotional abuse. You deserve someone who treats you better, much better. Just say it, Ruth, say it. You think I should leave. Ruth looked me in the eyes. She held my gaze. I think you must leave. And I'm not saying this as your old therapist, but as your old friend. I don't think you could go back, even if you wanted to. It might last a little while perhaps, but in a few months something else will happen and you'll end up back here on this couch. Be honest with yourself, Theo, about Kathy and this situation, and everything built on lies and untruths will fall away from you. Remember, love that doesn't include honesty doesn't deserve to be called love. I sighed, deflated, depressed, and tired. Thank you, Ruth, for your honesty. It means a lot. Ruth gave me a hug at the door as I left. She'd never done that before. She was fragile in my arms, her bones so delicate. I breathed in her faint flowery scent and the wool of her cardigan, and again I felt like crying. But I didn't, or couldn't, cry. Instead, I walked away and didn't look back. I caught a bus back home. I sat by the window staring out, thinking of Kathy, of her white skin, and those beautiful green eyes. I was filled with such a longing, for the sweet taste of her lips, her softness. But Ruth was right. Love that doesn't include honesty doesn't deserve to be called love. I had to go home and confront Kathy. I had to leave her.